Hi, Greg Andrick here. If you're like me, you've probably been wondering about these inflation numbers that are being released and that they seem awful low compared to our personal experiences. Well, I have a little presentation, and then behind that is about a 4-minute video from the Wall Street Journal that'll show you how the information the Fed is basing all these decisions on is being made. So I think you'll find it really interesting. I'm going to start my slide presentation to show you the different pieces of information that are important about how the Fed gathers the info. And then there's a slight video that in more detail discusses the process, and it's a real eye opener. So enjoy what's coming. So this is the presentation on why the Fed thinks inflation is only 8.3%. So the first thing is that data collection methods haven't been modified in years. When you look at the video that I'm telling you about that you're going to see right after this brief presentation, the data collection methods for housing looks like it was developed in the late 40s or early 50s and really hasn't changed much. And the overall approach, some of the items are only updated every 6 months and some of them only once a year. And the methodology they use to equate home ownership and the cost of home ownership to be put in the calculation is a little convoluted to say the least. It takes a year for most data related to the cost of housing to get into the current calculation. Well, that means that the numbers that the Fed are using right now has no reflection on reality at all. The basket of goods and services isn't updated frequently. For example, I have a slide at the end of these slides that shows you what the makeup is of the basket that the Bureau of Labor Statistics uses to calculate what we all pay for in supporting our living expenses. And in that, housing is 33% of the total. Remember that the largest expense everybody has is taxes. The average American pays more in taxes, excise taxes, phone taxes, road taxes, gasoline taxes, income taxes, Social Security taxes, and all these different things. We pay more in taxes than we do food, clothing, and shelter combined. And this basket isn't updated very frequently. And they're currently using a number that's 33% of the total goes to housing. And the real number for the last couple of years is 38%. They're already understating everything by about 5 percentage points. The other thing that's very interesting is in the calculation, it's the Fed uses these numbers, but it's really the Bureau of Labor Statistics considers that housing is an investment. Well, the reality is in a period of like we're experiencing now of these unprecedented rate increases and mortgages jumping in such a large amount in such a short period of time that for most Americans, housing is really a consumable, not an investment. It's a consumable that could potentially have an investment uh, return or basis to it. And if everybody remembers 2007 and 8, when everybody was treating it like an investment, and we had the liar loans, and everybody wanted to get in on it, and then it all crashed. Well, not much of a stable investment there. The current methodology doesn't reflect what is currently going on. So I was in my credit union just the other day, and I refinanced my house for 2.25% for 15 years 2 years ago. And they had one of those TV screens behind the tellers, and the current rate for a 15-year loan is 6%, so almost double. And the rate for a 30-year is 7.25. Both of those rates are going to go up by 3/4 of a point, the Fed's latest interest rate action over the next 30 to 60 days. It takes that long for those things to work their in and affect mortgage rates. So these are massive increases in a very short period of time that's affecting and basically causing the housing market to come to a screeching halt, which will then have the domino effect for all the industries that support housing. So here is the basket of goods that the Bureau of Labor Statistics gathers, but they don't gather it all the time. And like I said about certain portions of the real estate one, rents aren't included every month. The rents are done by region. So the most any region is updated in a year is 2 times. And there's a big difference between places like Miami, where rents went up 50%, and Iowa, where they went up, 15%. So, and housing is basically by and large updated every 6 months, but it's this convoluted calculation that it's really an investment, and they do a rent equivalent, and you'll see in the video, it's a real eye opener. It's very interesting. So again, why the Fed thinks it's only 8.3%, well, the upshot of this and why we need to consider these things is to navigate a world of irrational decisions, of an administration that causes oil companies that buy federal leases to drill on where they won't issue the permit, causing them to sue. That has a direct effect on the cost of gasoline. Going to Iran and Venezuela, whom we've sanctioned, and asking them to give us below OPEC prices, kind of a bizarre irrational decision. Then just the overall decision-making process of the Fed, maybe we're lucky they're using this lower number, that if they were really basing their decisions on the fact that inflation was close to 20%. And remember that to control inflation with interest rates, you have to get the interest rate above the inflation rate. And it wasn't until 1970 that they didn't even think the situation is possible, stagflation, where you'd have rising prices and a declining economy. Now, apparently, the economy didn't decline last quarter, but just like looking at these inflation numbers, I think one is not out of line to be circumspect of how they calculated that. I would say the next thing is to be sensitive to employees, vendors, and customers, because things are jumping at such a high rate and so quickly that it's putting a lot of things out of reach. So I think a certain amount of empathy and cooperation is probably called for and will help your business survive all of this. The policymakers are clearly out of touch. And when you consider the types of decisions that they're making, I was surprised that they did a full 3/4 of a point. And, if they're thinking it's 8% and it's really 20, maybe we're lucky they only went up 3/4 of a point. But think of the devastation that it's basically doing to business activity. So it becomes important that the first way to lead yourself out of stagflation or a declining economy with rising prices is to define your market and your mission. I have a post that's pretty much everywhere, my profile, the Power and Performance Coaching page, and other places, that is highlighting what Pepsi's done. And Pepsi was able to increase their earnings by 22% by getting out in front of inflation, by defining their market more sharply, and then to execute well and be efficient. And I think that if you define your mission and come up with a mission statement, that's the very first step to finding who your real key customer is and service those key customers. Because if inflation continues to go and the economy continues to go down, just today, Facebook has announced massive layoffs. So you've got pretty much every major company out there is getting ready for this to be a pretty grim economy and is cutting costs. So the first step is to evaluate your market, and the second step is to cut costs. So some of the majors are already in the cost cutting mode. So beware. And for you, I think identifying who your real market is and what your mission is to them will bind your customers to you in a way that you'll survive these irrational decisions, the inflation, and certain other economic issues. Anyhow, this is the bottom line of everything. Tighten your key relationships. Your employees, your vendors, your customers, the people you do business with. It's like creating a tribe. You need to be in tight with them to continue to function, to make money, to keep the doors open. So I think you'll find this video on how inflation is calculated for housing, and I think it basically shows how the other processes are probably done as well. So I think you'll find it very interesting. Enjoy. It's going to be posted everywhere. So thank
you. Food, housing. These are some of the biggest categories in the Consumer Price Index market basket, one of the measures used to track inflation. And here's how they're weighted. You can see housing, or what the BLS calls shelter, makes up about 1/3 of the market basket, which means it can be a big factor in either driving or tempering inflation.
I think that shelter inflation is going to remain high for some time. We're looking for it to come down, but it's not exactly clear when that will happen.
But it's also one of the hardest numbers to measure. And as you can see here, it can keep rising even when inflation in other items begins to slow down.
That can make things complicated for the Fed and policymakers if they're trying to push inflation down, as they are right now.
Here's why housing is one of the trickiest items in the basket to measure and why it holds so much weight in the overall index. When the BLS measures for shelter, it's measuring for the service that a housing unit provides its occupants, or more simply, the cost or value of your home.
You think of how much money you spend every month, a big chunk of that goes to your rent or your mortgage, and that's the case for households across the country. So if it's a big part of your monthly spending, it's going to be a big part of the overall inflation calculation.
The index includes changes in prices for 4 different categories, but these 2 are the most important: rent and something called owner's equivalent rent. Let's look at this one first. On the surface, it's pretty self-explanatory. It tracks prices people pay for rent. While it's less volatile than home prices, measuring for rent poses some challenges for the BLS because it's sticky. That means it changes infrequently, since most prices are locked in place throughout a lease term. But that sticky price means the BLS has to gather data for it differently than it does for other categories. Data for things like food and transportation are gathered every month or 2, but it's only gathered for rent every 6. Sample areas, called panels, report on a staggered schedule, so one might report prices in January and July, while another reports in February and August. That means that changes in rent might not trickle into the BLS's data for months down the line.
What the BLS is trying to do is it's trying to capture both the people who are in the market for a new apartment, who are signing new leases, and the people who are in their existing lease, who are paying the same price they were paying last month. So the BLS is trying to get a picture of the overall market, sort of every renter.
According to a study by the Dallas Fed, changes in the rental market can precede changes in the shelter index by about a year.
You have to wait for enough people to sign new leases or to renew their leases for those price increases to actually show up.
But this isn't even the trickiest part. The other, even bigger slice of the index is called owner's equivalent rent, or OER. This is the price an owner would pay to rent a comparable home. The BLS doesn't factor house prices into the CPI, so they don't show up directly in this. That's because it considers home ownership an investment rather than a consumable good or service, like food or airplane tickets. So instead, the BLS assigns owned homes an equivalent rent based on the average rental prices in the area. It's an estimate. So rental prices can cause a lag, and OER can be somewhat imprecise. And you can see that that can make the shelter index look really different from what's actually happening in the housing market. That can make a difference in inflation numbers, because, as you can see here, shelter is taking up an increasing share of the overall CPI. Here's Douglas Holtz-Eakin, former director of the Congressional Budget Office, on the importance of bringing shelter inflation down.
If the Fed wants to hit a 2% target and shelter inflation's at 6%, everything else has to be 0. That's not going to happen. So the Fed needs to bring down shelter price inflation, and it will increasingly raise rates and tighten financial conditions until it does.
This pressure means the shelter index's lag can make things complicated for Fed officials. We're looking to affect overall inflation month to month.
The last thing they want to see right now is inflation going up. I mean, they've already put in place a number of rate increases. They have more planned. So they're really looking for signs that inflation is coming down. And this is pushing in the opposite direction, even if it's, likely to be temporary.
Fed Governor Christopher Waller said in October that while housing inflation should slow, increases in broader interest rates should help moderate demand and damp inflation in other sectors in the meantime. Though there isn't a specific date that the shelter index could start to cool, economists expect it to start to come down anytime between the end of the year and mid-2023. But it will keep adding to inflation even as the housing market settles down.